I watched a movie on the weekend called You Don't Know Jack, and it's kind of a docu-drama about Jack Kevorkian. I guess it was produced by HBO. Now, I knew who Jack Kevorkian was. I'd seen him in the news years ago. They called him Dr. Death, and I knew that he assisted people in committing suicide, people who felt that their quality of life was such that they just didn't want to continue. I didn't know much else about it. I knew he was controversial, but I didn't really follow the story that closely. And somebody told me that this movie was pretty good, so my wife and I decided to watch it on the weekend. And I thought I would do a vlog about it because I got stuff to say. Now, one of the things that's interesting about the movie is it takes the time to show him and his personality and his life, and it also shows the people that he helped commit suicide. And you got to see, you know, what they were like, and I think they were done by actors, but they were very convincing. But you got to see what their side of the story was, why they wanted to end their lives. And one of the things that struck me was, in every single case, they had the support of their loved one. Their loved one would say, you know, look, I completely understand why they want to do this. I live with them. I see what they're going through, and they're suffering, and you know, it's their right to not want to live anymore. And that was the first thing that struck me was, okay, well, if the person you love the most is on board, I don't know that anybody else really matters. You know, if they weren't on board and they were trying to prevent the person from doing it, well, that would be one thing. And there was one instance where a woman prolonged calling Dr. Kevorkian because she didn't want her husband to die. And I think the story went something like she asked him what he wanted for Christmas, with, you know, anything in the world he could have. And he said, I want you to call Dr. Kevorkian. That would be the best gift you can give me. And so she did. So that was one fascinating part of it, was to hear their stories and, you know, hear about not being able to sleep due to pain, or one woman had Alzheimer's. She didn't know where she was when she went into her front yard. And they were ready to die, and they didn't want to live anymore. One guy was a paraplegic who couldn't move anything but his head, and, you know, his quality of life, in his opinion, and I might agree if I was in the same position, was such that he just didn't want to live anymore. And at that point, you have to ask yourself, you know, are you living for others, or are you living for yourself? You know, it's nice that if that was me, it would be nice that people came in to talk to me, and then they could leave the hospital room and say, oh, thank God he's still alive, thank God he's still in our lives. But, you know, that I'm still the one in the bed, living the rest of my life in a hospital bed with what in my opinion would be no quality of life. And I would know, I spent a whole month in the hospital and I came very close to dying at the time. If at that time somebody had said, this is what your life is going to be like for the rest of your life, the way it was at that time in the hospital, I probably wouldn't want to live either. There would be nothing for me to, I wasn't living. I was recovering and trying to work towards getting my life back. So I can kind of understand it, or I can actually very much understand it from that point of view. So I guess the big question is do we have the right to kill ourselves? And I think it's illegal in most places to attempt to commit suicide. If you do commit suicide, obviously they can't charge you at that point. But am I in charge of my own destiny? Can I decide I don't want to live anymore? Who has the right to tell me that I'm not allowed to take my own life? The people who want to be in charge of telling me whether or not I can kill myself, and I'm not going to kill myself anytime soon, by the way, or at all, ever, you know, they're telling me that what I can and can't do with my own body and with my own life. And you got to wonder, are you saying it from the point of view of not wanting to lose a loved one yourself? I think that if you're willing to sit there and say that this guy shouldn't help people commit suicide, and, you know, there was one woman who she gets an hour of sleep a day because she's in so much pain. Well, then you should have to live in her shoes. If you're forcing her to stay alive against her will, then you should have to walk in her shoes for a little while and experience what she's experiencing. It's nice of you to be a crusader and say, oh, well, you know, you shouldn't kill yourself. You know, life is precious. I'm going to go to bed now and get 10 hours while you know, you're agonizing all night. I don't think that's fair. I think this woman should have made the decision herself, made it with her family, but in the end, I think it should have fell in her lap whether or not she wanted to continue. And one of the things that was interesting is he's turned a lot of people down. He doesn't just show up and say, yeah, I'm ready to go. Then he's like, okay, well, let's get it started. It looked like he had a pretty extensive process for, you know, determining whether or not somebody was really in a position where, you know, he felt justified in helping them do that. And so I found that part interesting too. He wasn't just, you know, call him up, he shows up, hooks up the device, you kill yourself, he leaves, says thank you very much. It wasn't like that at all. Now, another interesting part of the story is a lot of the people who were against this were saying that only God has the right to decide when somebody dies, and that we as human beings don't have that right, or specifically he doesn't have that right. Now, I found this extremely interesting. If you actually are of the mindset that God determines whether or not you die, then you probably are of the mindset that any illness you get comes from God. So, for example, if I'm of that mindset and I get cancer, I probably shouldn't go in for chemo. I probably shouldn't get it treated at all, because God put it there. He obviously put it there for a reason. If I'm a religious person and I get cancer and then I go for chemo, then aren't I going against God in the same way that Dr. Jack Kevorkian is going against God? In other words, it was God's will that these people shouldn't die yet, but it was also God's will to give me cancer. So by me going into the hospital and getting chemo, or by Dr. Jack Kevorkian going and helping these people commit suicide, we're both going against God. When you think about it, if I get a headache and I pop a Tylenol, I'm going against God. God gave me the headache. Well, you know, I'm taking medicine to sort of counteract it. And there was a case in the States of a girl who was really sick, and their parents sat around and prayed that God would save her, and of course she died, and she could have been saved with medical attention. So, you know, people, the religious saying that only God has the right to take lives, I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of very religious people who were advocates of the electric chair. Religious people have gone off to war and killed. Well, people kill in the name of religion all the time. I don't think you can give Jack Kevorkian a hard time about that, especially considering the record of people in religion and the kind of hurt and killing they've put on the world in the name of religion. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. So the next time you're feeling your vision's going a little bit, don't go see the eye doctor. You got a headache? Forget about it. Pain in your chest? God put it there. It was His will. Come on. That's silly. I can't think of any kind of God that would want somebody who is living in agonizing pain to want to continue to live. And if He does, and He's up there, I don't want anything to do with Him. So the next thing that comes to mind is he was never charged until one of his very last patients, where he actually administered the drug himself. Up until that point, he set up an apparatus, but it was up to the person who wanted to commit suicide to actually start it going. So, you know, he would hook everything up, but then they would have to pull a string or do something. So technically the cops couldn't charge him with anything because he didn't kill anybody. You know, I could get a gun and load it and hand it to you, and then if you pull the trigger, I'm not really in trouble for it, technically. Because there's really nowhere that you can draw the line on that. If I jump off a bridge and kill myself, can you convict the manufacturer of the bridge of homicide? If I'm hunting and a buddy of mine asks me to borrow the shotgun because he sees a duck or a target and he shoots himself, am I responsible for that? I know it's not the same as hooking up a device in front of somebody and then giving them the opportunity to take their own life. Where do we draw the line between assisted suicide and just killing yourself? What if he had brought all the parts over but hadn't actually hooked them up? What if all of those parts existed in the home and they got the plans for him and they took those parts themselves and then hooked it up themselves? Who's responsible for that? How can you say that he's responsible for people's deaths when really all he did was facilitated them dying in a much better way than they would have if they had continued to live, and many of them would have died slow, horrible, painful deaths. And you know, he was giving them a way out, a way to peace, and you know, eternal sleep. So I think it's a gray area. It's a difficult line to cross. He did get arrested several times, but it wasn't in the end until the end when he actually did the injection himself that they charged him with. I believe they charged him with murder or second-degree murder, and he did, I think, 7 years jail time for it. So in the end, I think if you're sane and you're lucid, and you've talked it over with your family, and your quality of life is so poor, and it's not going to get any better, I think it's entirely your decision, and I think it should be made available to people. I don't see how or why we would force people to continue to live when they don't want to live, and justifiably so. I mean, I'm not talking about people who just want to commit suicide because they think their life is crummy. I'm talking about people who are physically suffering every single day, and there's no hope for a better quality of life. Who are we to tell them, to force them to stay alive against their own will and to suffer because it makes us sleep better at night? I disagree. I think that the option should be there. I think it should be there in a medical environment. You know, I think that there should be people to talk to. You know, a pretty not a lengthy process, but lengthy enough to make sure that it's exactly what you want. You know, interview them, But in the end, I have to agree that it should be an option, and I think telling people that it isn't an option isn't a fair thing to do if you're not in their shoes. So what do you think? Leave a comment below. I know it's a controversial issue. I actually didn't give a lot of thought about it till I saw the docudrama, but then my wife and I started discussing it. So those are my thoughts. Let me know what you think. Leave a comment below. Thanks for watching.